My name is Nayan Chanda. I'm editor-in-chief of YaleGlobal Online. It is our pleasure to have in our studios Dr. Carlos Lopes, Executive Director of the Economic Commission for Africa. Welcome to Yale.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to have you in our studios, especially in this occasion when you are discussing the issue of African development. The first question that I think many of my viewers would like to ask you is that has aid been a curse for Africa or has aid helped Africa? Just a broad question.
Actually, it's a debate that is quite topical. Right now, there are a number of developments taking place in the continent, and they have influenced the perception about aid effectiveness debate. There was a time where everybody thought that aid and conditionality associated with aid were responsible for developments in Africa. And now, somehow, it's the opposite. People believe that aid is not playing such an important role, and most of the developments are shaped by the fact that there is an emergence of Africa in terms of its role on investment trade, but also the interest of other parts of the world that are not traditional aid donors. My feeling is that this issue of attribution is really misplaced in the development debate. Normally, if development takes place, it's always attributable only to the individuals of that country. Now, the various factors that can influence that discussion, they can, of course, have some degree of influence, but we should not give them too much weight. The most important element of ownership of development process that conducts any country to transformation is actually the individuals of the country itself.
Yeah, I think is obvious. The question really is whether the aid has been misspent with a lack of proper supervision or control of how the aid was used has led to dispersal of aid for private gains and not help the country. That perhaps is one issue.
It is very clear that depending on geopolitical interests, aid has benefited certain types of policies. And depending on the period of your analysis, you can see the trends changing. Like for instance, during structural adjustment programs in Africa, in the 80s and the 90s, it was pretty obvious that aid was very much linked to a certain type of policies, prescriptive policies, reduced policy space in Africa quite considerably, and therefore, most of the aid was to produce liberalization, shrinking of the state, and you name it. On the other hand, you can also see that in other moments of history, for certain donors, there was a complicity between aid givers and aid recipients that could have been dictators or even people that were more interested in their pockets. And it has not produced really any poverty reduction or inclusion policies. But more recently, you can also say that people have become much more refined in the way they deal with aid. Budgetary support is one of the tools that is now very much fashionable in certain countries, and you can see it's also shaping certain types of outcomes. So I think aid has played always a role and continues to play a role, but this role has been shrinking over time precisely because of the realization somehow that it is very difficult to make it completely effective, although of course it can also contribute to major development outcomes.
Yeah. Africa is now suddenly emerging as a continent which sort of holds the future of the world economy because of, one, the population is growing there fast and its tremendous resources. Africa has 600 million hectares of uncultivated land. So technically, theoretically, Africa would become the world's breadbasket. So what are the obstacles in realizing that potential in Africa?
When people look into China, and they say, well, China is now becoming such an important contributor as a pole of growth. And its size in the world economy has expanded so dramatically that now it's not only the second largest economy, but is poised maybe to become the first. What people normally don't remember is that China used to have that position in the past. So it's like a circle that is coming back 180 degrees. Well, Africa is a bit the same story. The Industrial Revolution in Europe was not possible without cheap commodities from Africa. And to a large extent, we can say that part of the development that took place in Latin America in particular was due to slave labor from Africa, and of course the United States the same. So what is happening today is somehow just Africa becoming a bit more assertive in the use of its own resources. That's one element. Second is that the demand now is coming from different parts of the world. So there is no more this cheap acquisition of Africans' richness. So there are competitors, so the commodity prices go up. And as a result, Africans get a better share of the value of their products, although it's still not the full share, I would argue. And then the third element that I think is contributing is what you mentioned. The demographic dimensions of Africa right now have created a middle class, a younger population, more urbanized, more connected, better educated. And as a result, we have an internal demand that is quite substantive. And most of our growth is basically justified by these two elements, commodity prices and internal demand. So I think those are structural elements of the current boom that we are witnessing, with Africa becoming, depending on how you want to cut it, either the region with the fastest growth or the second if you divide Asia in blocks and you compare it with Southeast Asia.
Yeah. Also, I think the point you made about the rise of the kind of middle class, rise of the middle class. And middle class basically means an educated class with aspiration. And that aspiration also, I think, translates into demand for good governance. And that, I think, is perhaps one of the major obstacles to growth, is lack of governance in many countries.
Absolutely. And you see, we have in Africa an index that has been developed by a philanthropic foundation, Mo Ibrahim Foundation, that measures governance progress. It's a very thorough index with quite a large number of indicators and a very thorough methodology. And what you can see is that the number of countries progressing on economic and political governance is quite significant. And in fact, the majority of Africans today, in fact, more than 2/3 of the Africans today live in a better governed country than just 10 years ago. So there is progress. But this being said, of course, institutions are, hard to build. This doesn't happen overnight. Take the example of corruption and, accusations that Africa is corrupt here and there. I mean, of course it is true. We know that corruption is not an African phenomenon. But what is interesting is what type of corruption are we talking about? The corruption that you will find in Africa in most of the cases is the corruption that is associated with weak institutions. Institutions that are not yet with a level of sophistication that makes the rulers, if you want, accountable. It goes all the way from the way you tax people and the fiscal authorities to the way the president runs the country. So you have this weakness that is intrinsic to the fact that we are dealing with realities that have not yet developed the battery of regulations, methods, processes, and more importantly, counterpowers that will allow for more transparency and a better governance. But this type of corruption is not the most important corruption taking place in Africa. The most important corruption is mispricing by mineral companies. It's illicit financial flows and capital flight provoked most of the times by the fact that there is an exploitation of African natural resources. And this is not so much talked about.
Yeah.
And that is the big money.
Yeah.
Because if you just look into the transaction and financial flows between Africa and the rest of the world, it's very easy to detect that there is something missing in between.
A lot of rounding errors there.
Yes.
So the question then is, so far, natural resources has been a sort of prime mover for economic development. But mining, oil and gas or mineral resources or forest product does not really create jobs. So what are the industry you can see that could develop in Africa using its resources but producing jobs?
You are absolutely right. In fact, the whole mineral and extractive industry in the continent employs about 1% of the labor force. So it's quite negligible, although it's quite rich in terms of exports from the continent and also its contribution to the size of our economic activity. Africans continue to be poor mostly because they are in the primary sector, about 60%. The productivity is very low. It's the lowest in the world, 1.5 tons per hectare, more or less. It has not moved for the last 20 years, despite a lot of money being put by aid and other contributions from public funds. It has not changed. And of course, the fact that our industries have been under attack, we are not in a level playing field. Value chains have become very complex. Africans don't dominate trade negotiations, or they rather suffer from it. And as a result, we have an environment that is not favorable, including ingredients that make manufacturing possible, such as infrastructure, energy, all the enablers, including financial ones, are not there. Therefore, we have an industrial sector that has been shrinking. And part of this growth has been provoked by an explosion of services, but services that are mostly informal, also don't create modern jobs. So all of this points in the direction that we have a major problem of employment. So here you have 6% growth as it is predicted for this year, average for the continent, but you don't create jobs because the structure of the
unemployment roughly, somebody mentioned 40% of the people are.
I really don't like to quote employment figures for the entire continent because the level of statistical quality is so poor that it will be really hazardous to give averages on employment for the continent. Even for GDP, we know the problems that exist when countries do rebasing. Normally they double their size because there is a huge underestimation of Africa's GDP because of informal activities. But at least we know from financial transactions and the structure of the financial sector and the type of monetary instruments that you have, you can guess better. But unemployment is really quite hazardous because most of the activities are not formal jobs. Yeah. And it is very difficult to know whether people have occupations. But it is true that the majority of the population in the continent living in urban areas is not employed. So that much we know. And of course, there are a couple of countries that have better statistics, and then this becomes more tangible and it confirms the trend. But what I think is important for us to bear in mind is that unemployment, Africans are not going to make it with these poor services that are basically informal sector related or a very low productivity in agriculture because it has moved the value chain, it's not in agro-processing. So we really have to create industrial capabilities, and this is what we are arguing, that industrialization in Africa is not only possible but desirable, and also that it has to be a different industrialization from what others have done.
Different in what way?
Well, we cannot do import substitution like the Latin Americans did when they industrialized. Of course, we are even further away from the European industrial revolution. We cannot even copy, although it's from a timeline closer, the Southeast Asia export-driven model. Because all of these niches are more or less occupied. We are latecomers. But not only we are latecomers, but the environment and the context have actually become much more difficult than when those that I just quoted did it. For instance, you have much more regulation on trade. You have now a very complex value chain segmentation of industrial production. Intellectual property has become the most valued element of the equation. You, of course, have the financial system sophisticated in terms of transactions, access to equity, premium, insurances, and you name it. So for all those reasons, Africans cannot just do what others did. So how are they going to make it in terms of industrialization? Well, I like to argue through three very important entry points. The first one, we have a certain number of commodities that we have a controlling stake in the global market. We need a better bargain. And I think Africans have to position themselves to make sure that they move along the value chain. Maybe not completely, but they have to find ways of taking advantage of the fact.
Processing them to some extent.
Exactly.
Are we talking about some minerals?
Both soft and hard commodities. It works as well for coffee as it works for coltan. The second is that I think it is very important for us to leapfrog technologically. We can offer a cleaner industrialization than all the others. Because the technologies are available now. We are not married to any technological platform.
Coal-based technology.
Exactly. Yes. We can do it differently. And we have a huge potential on renewable energy that can propel this move. And the third, we have to look into our own markets. For that, we need regional integration, inter-Africa trade boosting.
That is what I'm going to ask you, that to have an integrated continent-wide market, you don't have to think of export substitution, export promotion, nothing. You can do it inside.
We have a huge room to occupy for the moment because, Africa continues to import yogurt, toothpaste. We have so much that we can do just, by making sure that you boost intra-Africa trade. And the potential is not only enormous for Africa, but is also attractive for foreign investors. Yes. Because they can see Africa as a market where they can position themselves, growing middle class. Yeah. And of course, it's going to be the largest labor force by 2040. I think we have...
2040, you said?
Yes. I think it's going to be important that industrialization in Africa and the debate about industrial policy is done in a way that is not a pure imitating of other realities, but rather organic and responding to these imperatives I just mentioned.
The one role that has been played in African development is the media communication. So cell phone has been a factor of sort of promoting a lot of services, right?
Absolutely. In fact, Africa has more cell phones than India, more cell phones than Europe, and more cell phones than the US. Internet penetration is larger than India. And if you look into the innovation within telecom sector in Africa, everybody agrees that it has been quite rapid and actually surprising. Africa has half of the world's mobile banking transactions. Half. And you would not have expected that the continent with the poorest, sort of education patterns.
This is leapfrogging.
Exactly. So I think, it's very clear that you can only do it with certain types of technologies. Sometimes because you use frugal technology or frugal innovation. Sometimes it's because, the simplicity of the technological sort of media that you are using, like cell phones or other devices, make it possible because they are very mobile, they are very easy to absorb. And I think Africans may surprise many by being a center of innovation in areas such as the IT. And I think this is very much the demonstration that I think we should use also for energy. Africans do not need to have solutions for their electricity deficit that are imitating the investments of other regions of the world. We can go very much into renewable, we can go to off-grid solutions. There are plenty of opportunities that now are mastered technologically, that Africa can be the pioneer or can be at least the terrain where this is expanded in scale.
That is excellent. And with that positive note, Dr. Lopes, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure.